Well, good morning. Couldn't even stop it when it came out of my mouth. Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Oh, that's going to be fun recovering from. But it is good to see everyone here. We'll be in Genesis chapter 3 this evening, picking up from where we left off, sort of. We left off on verses 6 and 7, but we're going to go back and talk a little bit about the serpent, which brings us to what we focused on last class, even though I said at the end of last class, see you all next week. Obviously, we had preaching last Sunday night. But one of the things that we really focused on last week is we looked at first the end of chapter 2 about how God sets a standard of what relationship and what marriage is supposed to be, being that between one man and one woman becoming one flesh, and that is a standard, as we talked about this morning, the standard of what marriage is supposed to be. And anything beyond that, as we looked at Romans chapter 1, would be considered by God to be unnatural. The natural state of marriage is what we see at the end of chapter 2, and then we saw that they were unashamed because they were naked and they were not ashamed, and that brought us to chapter 3, where we do not know how much time passes, as we made mention of, but that at some point the serpent comes to Eve and tells her and questions her about what they can and cannot do in the Garden of Eden, and she says, well, we can do and eat and make use of anything except this one tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If we eat of that, we will not die. And of course, the famous line being from the serpent, well, if you eat, you surely will not die. And we talked about how that is really the template for how the serpent, how Satan, the devil, works and functions and interacts with humanity, is that there will be something tempting, something that might hold a kernel of truth but will ultimately be a lie, and then that temptation is what works within the heart of human beings to then perform sin or to violate the Word of God, which is sin. And then we spent a lot of time in the second half of class talking about not only did Eve eat of the fruit because it desired her eyes, because it was good for food, and because it was desirable to make her like God, but also then Adam ate, and what we tried to do last time was focus just on those first 6 verses and see if Adam actually had an excuse, and the conclusion that we came up with was no, Adam was just as culpable. Without even going further than those 6 verses, we could see that he still made the choice to eat, and that was an issue. He did not question, he did not try and see the source of what he was eating, he just took it, and that alone, without even looking further of what the two may discussed, was enough to make him guilty, because he still chose to take the food and put it into his mouth. And what we sort of ended on was teeing up this discussion about the serpent. And I know over the last 2 weeks, some of you have come up and talked to me and asked clarification on what chapter in Ezekiel I was referencing. And so I want us, for the first part of this evening, to look at the serpent a little bit, because we didn't dive too far into it. So in verse 1, we're introduced to the serpent wholesale. In chapter 3, the serpent was more crafty than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made, and he said to the woman. That's our introduction to the serpent. We also recognize that the serpent lies and tempts Eve into eating of the fruit. Now, if any of you are like me, when you first read this story, or when you're younger, or when you're thinking about the story of Adam and Eve, what might be one question that pops in your mind very quickly about the serpent? What was that, Randall? Okay, that's a good question. Again, as I brought up last time, I guess I grew up on too many Disney movies. I just didn't think about the serpent talking, but you're not the only one to bring that up, Randall. That is an odd thing. Anything else? What does it look like? Yeah, what does he look like? That's an interesting question. Anyone else? A question that they all often think about with the serpent? Mitch? Yeah, that's always an interesting question. Cindy? That's the question that I always ask. That's the first one on my mind. Not that all the questions you all brought up are also valid questions, but I'm more in line with what Cindy just said. My first thought was, well, why was he there? How did he get there? And some of the questions that you all asked, there are not clear answers to. We don't know exactly what Satan or the serpent would have looked like. There's some speculation. You'll hear some people saying maybe something like a dragon or something more like a dinosaur, some other reptilian creature that they had legs, or that they may have heard one wild theory that they floated, which is terrifying. Flying snakes, no. Don't like it. But there's real no answer because the scripture doesn't give us one. We just know, like Mitch said, as we'll see later in the chapter, that the serpent was sentenced by God to now crawl on its belly, which means that it wasn't crawling on its belly before, but we don't know exactly what that would look like, what form it would take, and to really dive too deep into that is just pure speculation. There's really no right or wrong answer. We can just say, well, from the fall onwards, from Genesis 3 onwards, serpents were on their belly. But something that we can maybe find an answer to is the how and the why of the serpent. Let's turn over to Ezekiel chapter 28. This was a chapter that I made mention of at the end of last class. And some of you may still disagree when we look at this chapter, but there's something very interesting in the middle of this chapter. Now, Randy very recently went through all of the second half of Ezekiel, and this was, of course, one of the chapters that were covered. And in this chapter, it is in the midst of a lot of condemnations of foreign nations, of Israel, or not Israel, of Egypt and Assyria and the Syrians and Tyre, and Sidon as well. And Tyre is whom is focused in chapter 28. And the first 10 verses is a condemnation of Tyre and its king, specifically the king of Tyre, for being haughty and arrogant. And in verse 11, as we're going to read here in a few moments, there's a transition point. The first 10 verses seems to be one message or prophecy, and then there's a second half that begins in verse 11 of chapter 28. Mitch, could I get you to read for me? It's a little bit of a lengthy reading, but if I could get you to read for me verses 11 down through 18, please. Or actually 19, 11 through 19. Is that chapter 28 of Ezekiel? No problem. 11 through 19 of chapter 28. All right, thank you. So, the first thing to sort of establish is there a point of transition, or is this rather something that is a little bit different in the way that God is talking about the king of Tyre? Because as it clearly says in verse 12, that he says, take up a lamentation against the king of Tyre. But does it seem in these verses from 12 down through 19 that he's talking directly about the king of Tyre? Or might he be comparing the king of Tyre to someone?
Comparing to the serpent.
You're jumping ahead, but fantastic. That's what I tend to think, but we'll talk more about why. So, there's a comparison happening here. And the way that we can see that there's a comparison is verses 12 and 13. It says, you had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and beauty and perfect, or full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Well, that doesn't seem that could be talking about the king of Tyre, but maybe. But verse 13 is where it really seals a comparison in my mind, is you were in Eden, the garden of God. Well, wait a second. This is the king of Tyre. How could he have been in Eden? Which, for me, concludes definitively that the king of Tyre, in his arrogance, in his haughtiness, God is comparing him to someone else or something else, to another being. And that being in verse 14, this cherub who covers. Now, some, again, I know there's some people that I've talked to this before that even when going through it still disagree, which is fine. But the question then becomes, okay, who is this cherub who covers? Well, if we look at verse 13, you were in Eden, the garden of God, and every precious stone was your covering. And then it lists all these different types of precious stones. Now, could we think of something that might have been in Eden that would match the description of verse 13? Okay, Adam. I don't know if we could describe Adam as having precious stones as his covering, as something that would cover him. Anyone else have an idea? In the garden. That would be in the garden that would fit the description of verse 13. Oh, I thought you said in the garden. I thought you were asking a question. The garden itself, that's possible, but then that wouldn't be the cherub who covers. It wouldn't be a person, that would be a thing. It seems like the king of Tyre is being compared to a person, not necessarily a place. Though I don't think that that's a bad stab at it. Anyone else have a possible idea? An animal possibly? What'd you say, Tammy? A cherub? Okay, what is a cherub? It is another word for an angel. It is a protector, a cherub who covers. That phrase is, if you're covering something, you're defending it, you're shielding it. So possibly a cherub. But Dana, you said an animal. Is there an animal that we could think of that could be described as being covered, its skin being covered in precious stones? Someone said something. A snake. Why a snake? Right. So we could think of maybe a snake because snakes look like, some species of snakes look like they're covered in precious gems. What's the name of the baseball team for Arizona? The Diamondbacks, which is a type of what? Rattlesnake. Because if you've ever seen a picture of a diamondback, it literally looks like there's a diamond. Its scales make the pattern of a diamond, which would be considered a precious stone. So perhaps there was a serpent that looked like it had on its back all of these coverings of precious stones, or rather etchings, not coverings, of precious stones that would then appear as if it was covered in the ruby, the topaz, so on and so forth. serpent that would be unlike any other serpent. Lisa?
How is considered as a serpent is something that can sneak in, because a serpent sneaks in behind its prey
Mm-hmm.
and strikes.
Okay.
So it was kind of like the way he turned on God in a way. He snuck in through the back door and attacked from behind by taking Eve and Adam in that way.
That's an interesting point. If we look further down, this cherub who covers in verse 15, it says, you were blameless in your ways. Presented itself as this cherub as being blameless, as being perfect, as having the seal of perfection on it. And as Lisa just said, that was a very interesting comment of, serpents can be very crafty, very sneaky. They come in often behind their prey, and that's similar to the way that Satan betrays God by tempting Eve. So let's continue on the assumption that perhaps this is a serpent, or rather referring to the serpent in the garden. Then look at the rest of the verses, and for me, it all starts kind of clicking into place. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created until unrighteousness was found in you. You were filled with violence. I have cast you out as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you from, O covering cherub, from the midst of the stones. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom, and I cast you to the ground. Now again, some of you may disagree that this could be talking, and that the king of Tyre is being compared to a serpent, specifically the serpent in Eden. However, if this were true, this kind of gives us an answer to the question that Cindy was having of how and why. We already talked about in verse 14, if it's referring to a cherub who covers, a cherub who covers would be someone who is set to defend something. If you're covering something, you're shielding it. What in the garden would be worth setting a guard or a protector or a shield over? Tree of life, possibly. Adam and Eve, possibly. But what else? What was the one thing in the garden that was restricted? I know it's a mouthful. Yes, exactly. As Luffy said, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. One of the other questions I've always had is, wait, when you have something valuable, you put a guard over it, or you put something to protect it. I always wondered, why was there never a guard to the tree? Now, of course, the very easy counterpoint to that is, well, that was the whole point, is Adam and Eve were supposed to resist. There didn't need to be a guard because they should have just obeyed God. And that is a very valid and very fair point. But I also wonder if these verses are not pointing to the fact that there was a being guarding the tree. A being that had the seal of perfection, that was considered blameless and upright, until that being made the choice to follow unrighteousness. And then, because of its choice, was cast out from among God, cast out to the earth, and thrown down to the ground, and considered to be profane in front of all of the world, and was eventually destroyed and trampled upon by God. Something to think about. Any comments or questions before we move on there? Lisa? Mm-hmm.
That came to earth. They were angels that actually came to earth and walked the earth. So could there have been in the
garden. Think it's very possible, and if we read this and think that it's comparing the king of Tyre to something, regardless of whether we think it's a serpent or not, it says that the cherub who covers was in the Garden of Eden. So I think that's certainly possible. Now we'll talk more about the Nephilim and whether or not they were angels and such when we get to chapter 6. But specifically if there were cherubs or angels in the garden, I think it's possible, especially when we look at verse 14 and verse 12, or verse 13 and 14, of we have this cherub who is in the garden. Or at least, if it's not talking about the king of Tyre, God is making the claim and comparing the king of Tyre to this cherub who covers.
So a lot of times, too, in the Bible, he refers to different things as different, refers to them as different, how do I say that?
It's different, in different descriptions.
Exactly. So saying as a serpent, I would say like you snake.
Right.
So saying as a serpent, that's why I'm wondering if it was not saying my own feeling, but saying as a serpent, saying the devil was a serpent because of the way he felt or the way he felt about him. He now considers him a serpent because of the way,
I see what you're saying.
you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is kind of in post hoc referring back to the devil as a serpent. I tend to think not, because when we look at chapter 3, it takes that idea of a serpent very literally, as like Mitch pointed out, you will crawl upon the ground from henceforth, and you will, dust will be your home, so on and so forth. So it would seem that it was talking about a literal serpent in chapter 3, at least, and not referring to Satan as, oh, you snake, but rather the devil, Satan, took the form of a serpent, or was in the form of a serpent. Does that make sense?
Was that before or after that he said that he would crawl upon the earth?
It was after he tempted Adam and Eve, as we'll read later in chapter 3. Any other comments or questions on Ezekiel before we move forward? Christina?
Okay, I'm a little slow on the uptake here.
Yes, ma'am.
So we're saying that Ezekiel could point to this was the fall of Satan right here in the Garden of Eden. This is when God was like, all right, you used to be one of mine, but now you don't get to be one of mine anymore.
Well, what we're kind of, to be more clear, is Ezekiel is prophesying against the king of Tyre. And starting in verse 12, that the king of Tyre is being compared to another being. And that other being possibly the serpent, possibly Satan. And that God is talking about how Satan was perfect, how he was one of his angels, and then fell. And the sort of point that the one point we could think of where that happened is, well, not the point, but a possible point, is when you have Satan turn against God and tempt Eve.
Okay, so then when we look into Revelations, chapter 12, verse 9, where it says, so that huge dragon, the ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, was thrown down to the earth and his angels along with him.
Mm-hmm.
So he could have not been the only cherub in the garden?
That's possible. I want to be clear. I cannot say definitively what this is saying, but this is a possible option. Now, I believe it, but you're free to disagree with me. But that's a good point. There could have been other cherubs. This may not be referring specifically to Satan. However, my small counterpoint to that would be when you talk about what would be the one being where God would compare someone as arrogant and haughty to Tyre, or to the king of Tyre, that would make a good comparison, saying, you are so haughty, you remind me of Satan, the arrogance that Satan had, who was perfect, and you're holding that same arrogance, that that seems to be a more apt comparison than saying, I compare you to some random angel that fell. Just my small counterpoint to that. Ian?
Muddy the water just to going back to Genesis and not so much Ezekiel. However, it does tie in with that idea. I'm not 100% sold on the Ezekiel thing, but it's obviously something very tempting to think about. When it talks about the serpent, and it uses that word there, we have three Hebrew letters, we have three Hebrew consonants, I should say, and no vowels. How you pronounce that word depends upon the vowels that you throw into there. That depends upon the vowel points that you choose
Right.
to use. Overwhelmingly, the vowel points used make it say serpent or snake.
Right.
That's not shallow. But if you change two of those vowels, you get shining. And if you change them a third time, you get something akin to like deceptive or clever or some sort of like an omen breaker.
Mm-hmm.
The more I read at it, I don't think that any one of those is ruled out. And in fact, I think that the writers understood that and use it as sort of a triple entendre, like we get with many other words in the Bible where it says this, but it also means this, and it's used in that same way.
Mm-hmm.
All three of those definitions fit. You have a snake or serpentine-like creature, however you want to define it. You also have the idea of shining, which is used elsewhere in the Bible,
Right.
speaking specifically of serpent-like creatures. And then this idea of deceptive knowledge. To call it, I'm just going to say this, to call it simply a serpent, I think is not understanding what's being relayed here, because God then pronounces a very harsh curse
Yes.
upon an animal that he created. That doesn't seem to fit with what's going on here, nor does it fit with the description about how it's more shrewd than any of the wild animals that were created. It can speak. It just has so many more properties that lend itself to the idea that there is something far more significant about this being than it's just a serpent.
And that kind of, I agree to an extent in that I think when we really look at it, and I look at it from the Ezekiel 28 perspective, this was not just a regular garden variety serpent. There was something special, something that was clearly seen that made this serpent different than the garden snake we might see outside. And so I would agree to an extent that this is a very special being. Now, do I still think it resembled a snake in some way? Yes. But I would agree that if just saying that this was a common, rattlesnake or a mamba or something like that, I think is oversimplifying things. This was a very special and unique creature. Getting to the point that Randall said earlier, where I kind of joked about it, but I wanted to bring this back up, is, yes, snakes don't talk. That is a pretty unique aspect of this creature, showing us that there is something different about it. And I do think that that's an interesting point. But let's go back to Genesis 3. Any last comments or questions before we move on from talking about this aspect of the serpent? Lisa? Say that again. Yes, parrots do talk, in a way. Yeah, arguably parrots more mimic than they do talk. They take sounds in and they echo the sounds. But I want to try and move on a little bit from this so we can sort of end out the chapter and get towards the end. So we'll, of course, if we look back at verse 7, we see that Adam and Eve sew for themselves garments because they realize that they are naked. One of the points we made last class was the idea of nakedness was something that they didn't even have a conceptual idea of, because the idea of shame, the idea of what nakedness is, was so far removed from their thought process because they had no concept of what right and wrong was, because they were completely ignorant therein of ooh, I should be ashamed of my nakedness. It didn't even register as a concept. And immediately when they eat of the fruit of the tree, they now understand what nakedness is, and in their shame, they try to make garments for themselves. An interesting perspective of how there's this monumental shift in the way that they think, because now they know what shame is, they know what nakedness is, and they know they have to cover themselves so that they do not feel ashamed. Go ahead, Dana.
Prior to their sin, there is no reason to be ashamed.
Exactly.
It's not that they're unaware they should be ashamed, but there is no shame.
Yes, I spoke poorly there. You're right. There is no reason to be ashamed. 100%, because there's no concept of it. There's no sin. So, very good point. So, and I say that is when God finds them, the sound of the Lord they hear in verse 8, and they hide themselves, and when God sees them, I want us to just skip down to verse 10. Micah Papillon, could I get you to read for me verses 10 through 12, please?
He said, I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself. And he said, who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree which I commanded you not to eat? The man said, the woman you gave to be with me, she gave me from the tree, and I ate.
Thank you. Actually, read verse 13 as well, Micah.
Then the Lord God said to the woman, what is this you have done? And the woman said, the serpent deceived me, and I ate.
Thank you. So, obviously, God uses the fact that they even know what nakedness is, to Dana's point, to identify, wait a second, you had to have eaten of the tree. Now, two quick points I want to make here that are a little below the surface. The first point is, do you think God knew that they had already eaten of the tree? Yes. So then why ask?
He wanted to hear it from them.
Exactly. He wanted to hear it from them, and I know the parents some of you parents in the room probably thinking, yeah, this is exactly what I do with my child. I knew they messed up, but I want them to say it, and I'm giving them the chance to be honest and to come clean about what they did. And as a dumb child once myself, 9 times out of 10, that doesn't happen. Well, I shouldn't say 9 times out of 10. More often than not, it may not happen that the child comes clean when confronted. But as a parent, and this is what God is doing here, giving Adam and Eve the opportunity to be honest, to come clean about what they did, knowing full well what has already happened. But he asks a question because he wants them to give an answer. Now they have a choice here. They can either commit another sin, which is lying, or they can be honest. And of course, they lie at first, or they obfuscate things, and then Adam and Eve, what do they both do in verses 12 and 13? They have a similar answer in what they what?
Blame someone else.
Exactly. Blame someone else. Adam, as we talked about, tries to shirk off responsibility to Eve, and as we already talked about, the blame is still fully on him, even if he tries to blame his wife. He took an action, but the first thing is, I blame Eve. And then God looks at Eve. Why did you do this? The serpent you made did it. Kind of tells you something about human beings, doesn't it? We're not good at taking responsibility for our failures. Someone had their hand up over here. Don, and then Vivian.
He did. It was he said it was God's fault. It was the woman you gave me.
Yes.
God gave me. So he was putting the blame all on God. It's like you created the world.
Yeah.
You created the issue.
And that's a great point as well. He not only tries to blame Eve, he goes, well, it was a woman, so it wasn't me, But really, God, it's your fault. You made an imperfect product. It's her fault. You gave her to me. That's a great clarification point there as well, is we see both things. We're going to blame someone else, and then either we blame another being or creature, or we blame God. These are the reactions, the negative reactions of what human beings will try to do when they're confronted with their sin. Either we're going to blame some other person, or we can blame another person, but then point at God and say it's your fault. Vivian? Okay. Judy?
Well, I heard it taught once in a class that the verse 9, God starts it right off. He says, where are you? This teacher of this class said that God said to Adam, where were you? In other words, where were you when Eve was being tempted? Where were you, Adam? You should have been there to protect her.
That's an interesting point as well, is we don't see Adam there. And as I think many brought up last class, is Adam is the head of the household, and yet Eve is sort of being the one that leads things, and that he was not leading her. And that's kind of that same point of where were you? Where were you during this whole situation? How come this proceeded to this point? That's an interesting interpretation. Vivian?
Yeah, and I know what she's saying, but in verse 6 it said, and also desired the things when she took and ate it, she also gave some to her husband who was with her.
Yeah.
He was there.
Yeah.
He should have stepped up and stopped it, but he was there.
Yes. No. Excellent points. Nita?
Well, I guess it's kind of bothering me. I was like, they just didn't seem like instructors. I don't know, because, I mean, they're in the garden. I don't know how many animals they encounter, but all of a sudden they get this, what is an amazing being, this snake. And all of a sudden it's talking. And the only other person they talk to, or being they talk to, is God. And so I think they would have been freaking out just a little bit, like, why, who is this?
Yeah.
You know? So,
And I think that's a really interesting point, and I'm kind of glad.
you know, the consequences of this mistake, you know, it was very dire.
Mhm.
But it's sometimes hard because, you know, it's like when you test your parents or other people. You don't know, are you going to be grounded for a month or a year or, you know, whatever. So I think since they didn't know the consequences of doing wrong, that was another kind of question I had.
Well, I see what you're saying, and I think that's an interesting point. The one little thing I would push it back on is that they didn't know that there were consequences to doing wrong. But God said from the very beginning, if you eat of the tree, you will die. He made the consequences known to them in chapter 2. And so that's the one part I would push back. But the rest of what you're saying is really interesting. I'm kind of glad you brought it up, which is that there's this, you know, they almost seem, you know, kind of not the brightest bulbs, you know, in the kitchen in a way. And that, you know, they don't know what they're doing. They don't react how we normally think we would react to a talking snake. But I think some that, instead of saying that they were, you know, maybe kind of dumb, but rather that they were so innocent and naive that they didn't know reality. They weren't thinking, because they were like children in that they were completely naive of morality and were so innocent that they were easily taken advantage of. Not necessarily that they lacked intelligence, but they were in a state of, I'm trying to think of a better word than ignorance, a state of innocence where they just didn't know better. Naivete is probably the best. Kate and then Carrie.
The point I was going to make was that it seems all very childlike. The point was like, well, he made me do it. I mean, as a teacher, I get that all the time after recess. You know,
Yes. Right.
all the time. But it all seems, when I think about Adam and Eve, how I've always thought of them as these adult, you know, bodies, but their minds were very childlike. And God tells us to have a
Right.
And then as you start to grow older, it's like, oh, dad's in the room, you know? Like, it changes.
Yeah.
As your body changes, you start to become more aware and more machine. And it's interesting to see that way.
And I'm glad you made the connection to Christ's point in Matthew 18, which is the innocence of children, the childlike, naivete, in a more positive sense, that there's this innocence that children have, and we see that with Adam and Eve. Carrie, and then I want to make one point before we end, so sorry, Ian.
The statement about how Satan appeared to Adam and Eve, he is not going to be a scary figure.
Mm-hmm.
He's going to be a very desirable thing to accompany.
Yeah.
That's got to be his strategy, like an angel of light. So
And again, I know this is kind of assuming Ezekiel 28 is talking about Satan, but if you imagine a creature that scales are gleaming to the point that they look like precious stones, kids like shiny things. That would be something captivating, disarming, to your point. But I want to make one quick thing before we end, and we'll touch more on this next week. But in verse 14, we've already talked about the curse to the serpent. Because you have done this, cursed are you more than all the cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you will go, and dust you will eat all the days of your life. Verse 15, and I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. There's a twofold curse here. The first half in verse 14 is the humiliation and the misery that the serpent will then have. You will go on your belly, you're going to crawl around, and you're not going to be like the cattle. On your belly you will go and you will eat dust. You're not going to be fulfilled, you're going to be just this sort of wretched creature. But more importantly, in verse 15, as I'm sure many of you know that if you've studied this in any depth, verse 15 is significant because it is the first messianic prophecy. It is the first time when we have sin enter into the picture. God immediately then goes into talking about the plan that we see according to Ephesians chapter 1 that was set before the foundations of the world. There was going to be a plan for man to be redeemed from their sin. And the first hint of that we get is in the very beginning of creation. In the earliest part of Genesis, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. The bruising on the heel referring to Jesus' death upon the cross, and the bruising on the head being Satan's crushing defeat by Christ when Christ conquers the last enemy of death. The last thing I want to say before we end is think about the timing here. There is no time that really lapses between man being separated from God and then God saying, I have a plan to fix it. We sometimes think of God, some people think of God as an unfeeling, sort of kind of chess grandmaster, sort of moving his pieces. And some people think, well, if God put Satan in the garden, that means God was setting up man to fail, and so on and so forth. But if we really had an unloving, a cruel, or an unfeeling God, one of the ways that I think would demonstrate that is that there would not be a resolution to sin as quickly as God says, even though Adam and Eve have no idea what it is, and in man's time it'll take a bit until it comes to fruition. However, immediately God says, we're going to fix this. I'm going to put enmity, and you, serpent, you're going to be crushed on your head. You're going to be killed. You're going to be destroyed. And this will happen through the seed of the woman. immediately God is showing that the plan is in place. Man sins, God begins to show that there is going to be a plan to fix that sin. Does that make sense? All right, well, we're going to try and finish chapter 3 next week. And then, as much as I want to talk about chapter 4, we're actually going to skip ahead because I want to, before we end the class, at least get into the flood. So we'll touch on chapter 3 next week, move into chapter 6, and really appreciate everyone's comments and questions. As a very, very quick aside, I found myself really missing this class last week because I thoroughly enjoy this, and that's not because I'm teaching, because we get such great discussion from all of you. So truly do appreciate that. With that being said, Nolan Papillon, would you mind leading us in a closing word of prayer?